Hello, I'm Marissa Schaefer.
And I'm Jenna Cantor, and welcome to Physiotherapy Performance Perspectives, a physical therapy podcast for performing artists.
Today we are interviewing Samara DiMattia. Welcome.
Hello, how are you guys?
Great, thanks for joining us.
Good.
Yes.
Of course.
Samara has been practicing physical therapy in Fairfield County, Connecticut for over 13 years. She has her own practice, Connecticut Dance Physical Therapy, where she specializes in treating athletes who participate in the area of performance sports. Samara danced professionally and was certified personal trainer before earning her master's degree in PT. Samara is the physical therapist in residence at several ballet schools where she has successfully implemented injury prevention and pointe readiness programs. She's been invited by many dance companies and schools to conduct lectures on injury prevention, pointe readiness, and nutrition.
Samara is here today to discuss turnout for dancers. Let's get started.
Okay, so first, how do you measure turnout?
Yes, so this is the million-dollar question. When I go into dance schools to talk about injury prevention and I get to this section, everybody gets really excited. Mm-hmm. And I usually pick one dancer to measure turnout. And once I do that, they all line up and want their turnout measured. Everybody wants to know how much turnout they actually have. So in the dance medicine world, we do it in 3 different ways. Mm-hmm. The first way is called a passive measure. That just means what you have available in your hip joint passively without actively engaging anything. We generally do that measure in prone, which means the dancer lies on their belly, and we use a tool called a goniometer, which helps measure joint angles, which I'm sure you guys know how to do at this stage of your career in physical therapy school. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, normative value, so like for a normal human being, hip external rotation or turnout is 45 degrees, which is a lot less than that 90 degree or 180 that we're going to talk about later. But if a dancer's been dancing from a young age and they've been using their turnout appropriately, you can get up to about 50, 55 healthfully. Mm-hmm. Anything beyond that, we see some additional problems if you have too much laxity or mobility in the joint. So that's the turnout passive measure. Then I get the dancer standing up at the bar, and we look at first position, and I take the goniometer again and do my measure. Now, generally speaking, you would anticipate that the passive measure should be in and around the active measure, but very often it's not. A lot of times I have dancers that have a lot of available turnout mobility passively, but then I get them up and they're not utilizing what they have. Or what's most common is they don't have a lot of turnout mobility passively, but I get them up on the floor and they have more mysteriously, miraculously, which we'll talk about later, which indicates that they're forcing their turnout. The third measure is standing on rotation discs, which I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with.
Yes, I am. They're like lazy Susans, right?
Yeah, a lot of dancers that have done physical therapy probably have been on them. So they look like little lazy Susans. You stand on them, 1 foot on each one, and you turn out into first position, and I do the measure there. Rotation disc measure is like our ultimate measure. It's the measure of how much functional kind of turnout mobility you have and really what we want to achieve. So that's the number that we really focus on when we're trying to develop more turnout.
Thank you, Samara. For that second active measure that you were just discussing, do you tell them exactly how to turn out in a process, or you just have them jump into it?
I just have them jump into it because I want to get the most honest
yeah, that makes sense.
measure. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
So I want to see how they turn out. Now, listen, 9 out of 10 times they know they're coming to a dance physical therapist.
Right.
So they're going to be now, if I peek in at class, which is why I love being a PT in residence, everybody's forcing their turnout.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
Yeah.
So from this, how do you safely increase turnout?
Right. So we're going to talk a little bit later about exercises, but the most safest way is to increase the muscle strength of these deep lateral rotators that we have. And actually core stability is a huge part of turnout. Being able to understand where your pelvis is in space is a huge part of turnout because our leg sits in our pelvis. The socket of the hip and socket joint is kind of like the pelvis. So understanding where your pelvis is in space is a huge part of learning how to safely increase your turnout. also just kind of addressing the neuromotor muscular components of the hip as a PT is really important. Just making sure that they're engaging the right muscle at the right time is huge. There's also different ways of turning out when your foot's on the ground. We call that closed chain versus open chain when your foot is open off the ground as if doing a développé. More importantly, I'd like to discuss ineffective or dangerous ways of increasing turnout. So what's huge all over social media is people in oversplits, you know, drinking their coffee and everything. All these posts, I see my patients show me all the time. It makes me cringe.
Yeah.
Not only is it dangerous, because often you could tell a dancer that, and lots of times younger dancers feel invincible and they don't agree with me that it would be dangerous, but it's ineffective because it ends up initiating something called the stretch reflex arc, which is a defense mechanism our body has set up to prevent us from tearing things like arteries and nerves. So the muscle will actually get tighter.
Interesting.
If you do oversplits. Yes. So I think once I tell dancers that, they tend to listen a little bit more.
Right.
Like forcing splits against walls or putting your feet up on blocks and sinking down, or most dangerous is if you have somebody push on you while you're in these positions.
Right. Oof. I just kind of got chills.
Actually, you were saying oversplits. I, in my head, know what that means. How many
Okay.
degrees would you say would be oversplits?
Or what does that look like?
Yeah.
Right. So anything that's like past 180 degrees, right?
That
so
straight line,
180 degrees, if you're in a split, is kind of like the normative value, but these dancers are putting their front foot up on a chair or something, so you're going past that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Speaking of 180 degrees, you kind of alluded to this before, but is perfect 180 degree turnout achievable and or achievable for everybody?
No, it's not physiologically possible.
Yeah.
The morphology of our hip joint does not allow for 180 degrees of turnout. More importantly, everybody's hip is kind of different within that range. So the things that we look at when we look at somebody's joint is the angle that the femur, which is that long bone that we're turning out, sits in the socket. The orientation of the socket is huge. So some people's sockets sit a little bit more forward and not to the side. And with some ballet techniques like Faganova, there's this aesthetic where your leg, when you're developing a Lascaux, needs to be completely to your side. Well, most people's sockets don't sit there. They sit a little bit more in front. So asking the leg to kind of go into that range is really hard, sometimes impossible. Also, the shape of the bone itself, of the femur and the femoral neck, determines turnout. These are things we cannot change. This is the morphology of your joint. What we can kind of change and work on up to a point, you know, like 12, 13 years old, is the elasticity of the ligament and kind of the capsule, which is surrounding the joint. And then also the flexibility and the strength of the musculotendinous unit, which we'll talk a little bit about later, can help you develop more turnout. But 180 is not really achievable. We get up to 180 by not turning out from our hip, but turning out from other parts of our lower leg, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But as far as hip range of motion is concerned, the morphology of the joint does not allow for a true 180.
No go.
Okay,
No
so
go.
to be clear, what is forced turnout then? Let's really define this so nobody can be in denial.
Right. So there's three kind of indicators that a dancer is forcing their turnout. I'll start from the ground up. The number one indicator, and I think the most common, is a dropping in of the arches or a rolling of that medial arch. So you'll look at their foot in first position or second position or fifth position, and instead of the arch kind of being lifted up off the ground, it'll be collapsed onto the ground. Very often, in order to achieve that 180 degrees, the dancer will take their foot and kind of what we call evert it and drop it down, and it'll make it look like their foot's at that 90-degree angle. but it's really not. So that's the first indicator. The second indicator is looking at the knee. There's something called screwing of the knee that we call in the dance medicine world. Well, we'll take our tibia, our lower leg, and we'll externally rotate it or turn it out on our femur. We know that the person is screwing the knee if we have them take a demi-plie in first position and their knee is not over their second toe. The line would be dropped down to the floor, basically. If you took a ruler and put it from the bottom of the knee, it would go to the floor instead of over that second toe. And then finally, the third way we know they're forcing their turnout is if they have what's called an anterior pelvic tilt or lumbar lordosis, which is kind of standing with a sway back and your belly hanging out. Dancers do this as a strategy because it helps to put the muscles in the front of the hip, the ligaments and the capsule kind of on slack, so you can try to get a little bit more turnout in your hip, but it is also kind of an indicator that they're not using their turnout appropriately. And all of these things, as we're about to talk about, lead to very bad problems and injuries. So,
gotcha. So,
yes.
Okay, so I heard the feet kind of roll in and do some funky stuff, so the knees kind of rotate too, and then the hips kind of tilt a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah,
All right, and those are kind of like the major ways that people force
Those are the
turnout.
3 indicators, yeah.
Okay.
And it's interesting, like if I'll go to a dance school, you can go through the levels and see in the very beginning, it's really hard for little kids to kind of access this turnout or this idea of turning out. So you'll see a lot of lumbar lordosis, a lot of tilting of that pelvis, a lot of dropping of the arches, and then you'll go a couple of levels up, and they've figured out somehow not to tip their pelvis anymore, but they're still working from the lower leg to force their turnout.
Gotcha.
And then hopefully when you get up to the pre-professional level, they figured out how to do it in a healthy way.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That's really what we're looking for.
They're slowly correcting it.
Yes.
That's what I'm hearing.
So they're doing all these things with their body to force their turnout. What are the consequences of doing all this?
So basically, there's a big disruption of what we call the kinetic chain. That's the forces that get transmitted through the center of each joint when we stand up. Our body is set up to kind of like have this kinetic chain be optimal and kind of like effective if everything is lined up appropriately. So you're going to completely disrupt that chain, and from a neuromuscular standpoint, you're not going to be able to generate forces in the same way. You're not going to be as efficient a mover if you disrupt this kinetic chain. As a result, we see injuries. The forcing of the turnout is the number one reason we see injuries in the dance world. They can be a whole host. It could be foot and ankle. It could be knee. It could probably be hip. It could be back because of everything that I just kind of said. Pick your poison. It often does depend on the level that the dancer is dancing at and the age and whether their growth plates have closed. But generally speaking, not only, I always like to stress this with my dancers, the consequences are not only injury, but they're the inability for you to really develop learning how to properly turn out. So the more you force your turnout, the more you're utilizing the inappropriate muscle groups. You're setting up these kind of neuromuscular patterns from a young age. When it comes time, when you're like, okay, I'm ready to use my turnout now appropriately, it's just harder to knock those walls down. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
totally does.
if I have a dancer and I do a dance eval and I have them do a développé à la seconde and it's all over the place, I'm like, listen, you've got to lower your leg. And it seems like so catastrophic for them, but the more you work within your available range, the better equipped you'll be to develop better turnout. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yes. Samara,
Okay.
you were saying forces up the kinetic chain. You defined it a little bit. Could you explain a little bit more for our listeners?
Sure. Basically, our joints are kind of designed to transmit our weight, which every time we put our foot on the ground, there's a force transmitted up through our foot and our ankle, our knee, our hip. And our joints are kind of designed to have that force go through the center of each joint. If you take your foot, for example, and force your turnout in your foot and drop that medial arch, you're going to have that force be transmitted through the inside of your joint. So very often with forced turnout, that's what's happening. Instead of your weight being distributed through the center of your joint, it's to the inside of our joint, and our joint just is not developed to accept that kind of a load, so it'll break down over time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was super clear.
That was great.
Thanks.
Okay.
So let's steer back to getting some healthy turnout.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about what muscles are responsible for holding your turnout?
Of course. The most important muscles are these deep, deep lateral rotators that are located underneath our big butt muscle, the glute max. They're tiny muscles. They're very kind of like fine-tuned muscles. So finding them can be very challenging for a dancer in the beginning. In addition, so that's your primary lateral rotators. The secondary ones can be your sartorius, which is this muscle in the front of your thigh. That helps when your hip is already flexed, as in like doing a front attitude. And then your adductor muscles, or your inner thigh muscles, help when your leg is already turned out by the primary rotators. He can kind of kick in a little bit, like doing a développé and stuff like that. In addition to that, the muscles that kind of attach in and around your pelvis, your transversus abdominis, which is your quote-unquote core, the stronger that is, the better you'll be able to hold your what we call pelvic neutral, and the better you'll be able to turn that leg out in the socket, because again, I said before, the socket is your pelvis. So if your pelvis is tipped one way or the other, like to the right or the left or forward or back, you're not going to be able to rotate the leg in the socket as well. So deep lateral rotators, sartorius, adductor, and then your core. I think those are the 4 things that you should address when you want to develop your turnout.
That's helpful. You mentioned this before, but what are the muscle imbalances created when turning out all the time? Because you were just talking now about the muscles we want to focus on. If we're not focusing, we're doing the opposite, which we went into great detail about. What would those muscles be?
So a lot of times the dancer will overutilize their like hip flexors, quads, like the front and side muscles in a dancer from being turned out all the time tend to get very overdeveloped. The muscles that are on the posterior chain, so your hamstring, your glute, those lateral rotators, tend to get weak. Just also because in the dance world, a lot of times our orientation is forward. So we're moving forward, we're doing things forward. With the exception of like doing an arabesque, it's very rare that we're going backwards. So if you think about it that way, the back muscles usually get weak and the front muscles usually get very overdeveloped and tight. And that creates a muscular imbalance. Ballet dancers are like supremely the most imbalanced population, I feel, just because of that aesthetic of the 180. And also this kind of like ill-conceived notion that being turned in is bad, right? So I'll have dancers that come in and lie on my table on their back, and I could see them kind of like forcing their legs kind of open in this turned out position and not kind of just lying where their leg should be. It's this constant kind of like understanding that I have to be working at this 24/7, getting more turnout, and then if I tell them that turn-in is just as important, very often there's a blank stare.
So
they don't believe me, but it's so true. So the more balanced your joint is, basically muscles work in pairs. When one muscle pushes, another one needs to pull. So if you don't have strength in the inside of your legs and the muscles that help you turn in, you're not going to be able to turn out as effectively.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. You just answered like the question I was going to shoot in there, which is you should be strengthening the back also, the back chain of your muscles as well.
Absolutely, positively, and the inner chain.
And
so the internal rotators, the adductors, absolutely to get balanced. And I can't tell you how, again, across now, primarily I only see dancers now at this stage of my career, which is totally awesome. But when I used to see other people, like soccer players, and I couldn't get over how much weaker the dancer population is in this muscle group. Like, it's really pretty phenomenal.
Okay, so kind of like onto that, speaking of getting stronger in that area, are there exercises that a dancer can do to gain better turnout specifically?
Yes, absolutely. So the most common one that we give dancers is the clamshell, lying on your side with your hips and your knees bent, and you open your legs kind of like a clam. I call it a seashell because I don't like clams, but
nice addition.
That's the most common
really
one.
funny.
And basically, as you're doing that, you have to make sure that call it your headlights are ahead, the front of your pelvic bones, the dancer will kind of lean back onto the side if they don't have enough turnout, because it kind of creates the illusion that they're getting more turnout. So again, doing these exercises honestly is really important, and keeping your pelvis in a neutral position while you're doing them is really important. So if you're able to do that with great ease, you can take a TheraBand and wrap it around your thighs and make it a little bit more challenging. But if you're struggling to do your seashell, then stay there. Don't add resistance of any kind. The other one that I really like is just lying on your back in what we call the hook lying position. So your knees and hips are bent, your feet are on the floor. Again, you're engaging your transversus abdominal, you're pulling your belly button into your spine, and you allow your knee to kind of drop open to the side and come back. This is a great way to feel where that lateral rotation is coming from and the deep lateral rotators. Or you can lift your leg up to the ceiling at a 90-degree angle with your knee extended and turn your leg in and out of the socket here.
Nice.
There's wonderful resources for dancers out there. The International Association of Dance Medicine website has some great turnout exercises. That's www.danceeducation.org. You could put that up on your website and indicate that some of these exercises are there. And those are really good rudimentary, kind of like beginner, how to find your turnout exercises. For the more advanced dancers, I have them purchase the rotation discs if they have the means, and we do exercises on that, because that's the best functional way, I feel, to develop your turnout, because you're standing, and most of the time you have to be standing when you're turning out.
Definitely.
And then for the really advanced dancer that's able to kind of like conceptualize, I really like Eric Franklin's book, Conditioning for Dancers. He goes into a little bit more depth in terms of how to kind of like visualize your leg turning in the socket, but that's a little bit more for older dancers. Like, I wouldn't give that to a 10-year-old.
Right. It's a lot of info, I'm sure, to take in.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Cool, thanks. I think we should totally put the danceeducation.org up.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
Yes.
To those of you listening, look out for that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is another question that doesn't quite logically flow, but Jenna and I associate a lot of dancers as like people who walk in turnout down the street.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we were kind of wondering what you thought about whether or not it's okay for dancers to kind of walk in turnout outside of class. Should they work on walking kind of like an average Joe with the toes more straight ahead, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of like a firm believer of gait being kind of a really individual thing, but our body's set up to perform the action of gait, walking, in a very specific way as well. And if you alter that, you're just not going to be an efficient walker. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So dancers' gait with the turned out toes is a super inefficient way to move. And it does kind of like reaffirm these muscular imbalances that we're developing in class. In addition to that, we walk all the time. So here's a great, most dancers are so strapped for time, and I'll give them these turnout exercises, but the likelihood of them doing them with any regularity is very slim. So if you can walk in parallel, well, that's a great way to develop those muscles, right? That we were talking about being so imbalanced before.
I like that.
Now, having said that, it's kind of hard to kind of like change the way you walk the older that you are, but if you can focus on it as much as possible, I do feel like it's very helpful. And I do feel like sometimes dancers, I certainly was guilty of this when I was younger. You go, I went to schools where there were companies housed in the schools when I was a ballet dancer growing up in the city, and you see the professionals walking like that, so you're kind of like, oh, I should walk like that. I know, like in the beginning part of my life, I was definitely forcing it, Then as I became older, it became a natural kind of part of my gait. And I remember I went to like a continuing ed class when I was out of school about gait, and the class did an assessment of me walking on the treadmill, and I was completely turned out. I was externally rotated, and they were trying to figure out, like, well, why is she rotating externally? Like, does she, blah, 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 is she compensating for something else, And then finally, my friend who was with me taking the class was like, she was a dancer. This is just how she walked.
Yeah.
Right. But now sadly have not danced in many years, I don't walk like that anymore. So that kind of indicates that it was something that was more of a learned behavior, that was unnatural. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But you convince yourself that it is natural. No, this is just how I walk.
Totally. To pass through first position each time you take a step. Yeah.
This is me. You can't change me. This is me.
That's right.
Okay, so now we're at my favorite question. And Marissa's always very kind to let me ask it.
Yes.
So please tell us your favorite story of treating a dancer.
I know. I was listening to your earlier podcast, and I was like, this is a fantastic question, and one that is so hard for me to answer because I have so many. I have been so fortunate to work with so many dancers that have gone on to have successful professional careers at Paris Opera and ABT and LA Ballet, and I'm such fans of them, and I always have a sense of pride. Of course, generally speaking, they and their teachers are the ones that got them there, but I also like to think that I kind of in some small way contributed to their success.
You definitely did.
I do love working with this population, but I have one very funny story. Which I don't believe anybody shared a funny story yet.
No.
So
I have this big smile on my face. I'm excited. We're both very excited.
Oh, good. So there's always the question of when can I go back, right? When you're injured. When can I go back to class? What can I do? So we have this very gradual progression depending on the injury. And I was working with a young pre-professional dancer who at the stage of her rehabilitation was in class pretty much fully, still not jumping or running, when she had to go to school and do gym. So she was doing great, no pain, really, really on the road to recovery. And she came in one day and she was kind of limping and she's like, my foot hurts. And I said, well, what did you do? Did you jump in class? No. Did you run in gym? No. So I'm just scratching my head, trying to figure out what happened here. So I said, well, what did you do this weekend? Did you have class? Did you have rehearsal? I just had class. I said, and then what did you do? She said, well, I went to a friend's house and we played outside. I said, well, what did you do outside? She said, I jumped on her pogo stick. So I've learned that you have to be supremely specific when talking about what a dancer is allowed to do and what they are not. I did not say to her, you cannot go on a pogo stick, right? I didn't say that. I just said you couldn't jump in class, but anyway, that's one of my favorite stories. So now I always say no pogo sticking as well, just to be clear.
That's good.
That's so great.
Yes, absolutely.
Only learn through experience.
Exactly.
Yes.
Well, that concludes our little session for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. It was my pleasure. This is a great thing that you guys are doing. So good luck to you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us for another episode of Physiotherapy Performance Perspectives. Join us on the first Monday of every month for the next episode.
To hear more of our episodes, click on the link in the description below to view our website. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/PT Performance Perspectives to stay informed. And finally, if you want to get in touch, email us at ptperformanceperspectives@gmail.com.